I arrived at the campsite on August 3rd, eager for a few days of peace in the woods. The air was fresh, and the trees rustled gently in the breeze. Everything seemed perfect, except for one thing: the old RV parked at the far end of the campground. It looked abandoned at first glance, but as night fell, I saw a light flicker inside. My curiosity got the best of me, and I couldn't help but wonder who lived there. Late that night, I was stirred awake by a series of strange noises. Soft, rhythmic thumping coming from the direction of the RV. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night, it was unsettling. I stepped out of my tent, the cool night air biting at my skin, and strained to listen. The noise continued, like someone knocking on wood, over and over again. I crept closer to the RV, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the louder the noise became. Just as I was about to peer into one of the small windows, the door creaked open, and an older man stepped out. His face was stern, his eyes shadowed by the dim light inside. He stared at me for a long moment before speaking in a gravelly voice. "You shouldn't be here." I froze in place, my mind racing for an excuse. Before I could respond, the man, Mr. Connors, stepped closer. His expression wasn't angry, but there was something unsettling about it. He lowered his voice and warned, "Stay away from here, or you'll regret it." With that, he disappeared back inside, leaving me standing there, a chill running down my spine. The next day, I couldn't shake the encounter with Mr. Connors. His words echoed in my mind, making me question what he could possibly be hiding. The campground was quiet, with only a few other campers scattered around. Yet every time I glanced toward the RV, I felt that same eerie pull of curiosity. It was as though the place itself was drawing me closer, daring me to uncover whatever was happening inside. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness crept over the campsite, I heard the noises again. This time, it was different. Along with the knocking, there was a faint murmuring coming from within the RV, like someone talking in a low, hushed voice. But as I listened closely, I realized something chilling. There was only one voice. Mr. Connors seemed to be speaking to himself, but with the intensity of someone holding a conversation. My heart raced as I made my way toward the RV once more, careful to avoid being seen. The closer I got, the clearer the voice became, though the words were impossible to make out. I crouched down behind a tree, just a few feet away from the RV's window, and strained to listen. The tone of his voice shifted between pleading and angry, but there was no response. No one else inside to answer him. I was about to leave when I heard a loud crash from within the RV. Startled, I pressed myself against the tree, heart hammering in my chest. The door creaked open again, and Mr. Connors stepped outside, scanning the area with a wild look in his eyes. He mumbled something under his breath that I couldn't make out, before retreating back inside and slamming the door shut. I stood there for a moment, frozen in fear. Whatever was going on inside that RV, it was darker and more disturbing than I had imagined. My gut told me to leave it alone, but something kept pulling me back. The mystery of Mr. Connors and his strange behavior was becoming impossible to ignore. The following days passed in a blur of tension. Every night, the same eerie sounds filled the air: thumping, murmuring, and occasionally a strange metallic clinking. I tried to focus on enjoying my time in the woods, but the RV and its mysterious occupant kept drawing my attention. It was as if the entire campground had fallen under a strange, suffocating spell. One evening, unable to bear the suspense any longer, I decided to follow Mr. Connors when he left the RV after dark. He moved quickly, with a purpose, heading deep into the woods. My heart pounded as I trailed behind him, keeping a safe distance. The trees seemed to close in around us, the thick canopy overhead blocking out even the moonlight. After what felt like hours, we arrived at a small clearing where an old, decaying shack stood in the middle of the woods. Mr. Connors entered the shack, and I crept closer, holding my breath. Inside, the faint glow of a lantern illuminated a cluttered space filled with old books, strange symbols painted on the walls, and odd trinkets that looked ancient and foreboding. The air felt heavy, as if the very space was charged with some unseen force. I watched through a crack in the door as Mr. Connors knelt down before a small altar, his head bowed. He muttered something under his breath, too quiet for me to understand. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just an ordinary shack. It was some sort of ritual space. Fear gripped me, and I started to back away, my mind racing with questions. What was he doing out here? What dark secrets was he hiding? Just as I turned to leave, my foot snapped a twig underfoot. The sound echoed through the woods like a gunshot. I froze, holding my breath, praying he hadn't heard. But then, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the door. I had nowhere to hide. The footsteps grew louder, each one sending a jolt of terror through my body. I pressed myself against the wall of the shack, trying to stay hidden in the shadows. The door creaked open slowly, and I caught a glimpse of Mr. Connors stepping out, his eyes scanning the darkness. For a moment, I thought he hadn't seen me, but then his gaze locked onto mine. Before I could react, he was standing right in front of me, his face twisted in a mix of anger and something else, something almost desperate. "Why are you following me?" he hissed. My mouth went dry, and I struggled to find words. The fear I felt was paralyzing, but I managed to stammer, I wanted to know what's going on." To my surprise, Mr. Connors' expression softened. He sighed deeply and motioned for me to follow him inside the shack. Against my better judgment, I stepped through the door, the air thick with tension. Inside, he gestured to the strange symbols and artifacts. "This place, it's not what you think," he said quietly. "I'm not doing anything dark here. I'm protecting this campground from something that once nearly destroyed it." I blinked in disbelief, unsure whether to believe him. He continued, his voice steady but filled with an underlying sadness. "Years ago, something was unleashed in these woods. I've been keeping it at bay ever since. The rituals, the symbols, they're wards to keep the dark force away. If I stop, it could come back." I stared at him, trying to process everything. The strange noises, the murmuring, the rituals. It all started to make sense, but it still felt surreal. "Why didn't you just tell me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Connors gave me a small, weary smile. "Would you have believed me?" he replied. His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. He was right. Had I not seen everything for myself, I would have dismissed it as the ramblings of a crazy old man. But now, standing there in the middle of the woods with him, I knew that whatever he was doing, it wasn't evil. It was a fight to protect this place. In the days that followed, I stayed at the campground, no longer afraid of the strange noises or Mr. Connors. We didn't speak much, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. When I finally packed up to leave, I glanced back at the old RV. For the first time, I felt a deep respect for the man who lived there, guarding secrets that most people would never understand. The world outside would never know what he was doing, but I did. And for that, I was grateful. The campground was quiet when I arrived on September 12th, with only a few scattered tents and RVs. It seemed peaceful enough, but something about the older man, 2 sites over, made me uneasy. His name was Mr. Avery, and he spent most of his time sitting in a worn-out chair, watching the woods in silence. It wasn't just casual observation. His gaze felt intense, almost as if he was waiting for something. I couldn't help but feel his eyes on me whenever I moved around my campsite. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the trees, I caught him staring again. His eyes seemed to follow my every move, unblinking and focused. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched was too strong. I turned to confront him, but he simply nodded and looked away, as though nothing unusual had happened. That night, as I lay in my tent, a soft tapping sound echoed through the campground. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. The tapping grew louder, coming from somewhere near Mr. Avery's campsite. I peeked outside but saw nothing unusual, just his dimly lit tent and the darkened woods beyond. Still, the tapping persisted, unnerving me more and more with each passing minute. I tried to fall asleep, but my mind kept racing, replaying the strange behavior of Mr. Avery and the eerie tapping sound. What could he possibly be doing out there in the dark? And why did I feel like something wasn't quite right with him? Despite my exhaustion, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening at his campsite wasn't innocent. The next morning, I felt a heavy unease as I walked around the campground. Mr. Avery was at his usual spot, sitting in his old chair, watching the trees with that same unnerving intensity. I tried not to meet his gaze, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that his eyes were always on me. Something about him was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I decided to keep my distance, hoping the strange sensation would pass. That night, the tapping returned, but it was louder this time. My nerves were on edge as I lay in my tent, every sound amplifying my fear. I told myself it was nothing, just an old man living in the woods. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The tapping grew faster, more frantic, like someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward Mr. Avery's campsite. As I approached, I noticed something strange. Carved into one of the trees near his tent was a symbol I didn't recognize, an intricate, swirling design that seemed out of place in the middle of the woods. I stepped closer, inspecting it, when I suddenly felt a presence behind me. I turned sharply and found Mr. Avery standing there, his eyes cold and distant. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice low and unsettling. "It's safer if you stay in your tent." I backed away, heart racing, and hurried back to my campsite. As I lay down, I couldn't stop thinking about the symbol on the tree and Mr. Avery's warning. Something was deeply wrong here, but I didn't know what. All I knew was that the tapping hadn't stopped. It had followed me back to my tent. The following day, I tried to shake off the unsettling events of the night before. But as the day wore on, the tension around the campground seemed to build. I noticed more strange symbols carved into trees near Mr. Avery's site, each one slightly different, but all just as cryptic. I wasn't sure if I should confront him again or leave it alone, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. It felt as though the campground itself had changed. Darker, heavier, like something unseen was watching us all. As the sun set, I prepared for another restless night. I double-checked the zipper on my tent, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that had settled in my chest. The tapping began again, just as it had the previous nights. This time, though, it was accompanied by another sound, a soft, almost imperceptible humming. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It wrapped around me like a suffocating fog, and I felt my heart rate quicken. I forced myself to sit up and listen carefully, trying to pinpoint the source of the humming. As I strained to hear, I realized it wasn't just a sound. It was a voice. Low, soft, and eerie, like someone whispering in a language I didn't understand. Panic bubbled up inside me, but I fought to remain calm. I needed to know what was happening, no matter how much it terrified me. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously made my way outside, heart thudding in my ears. The campground was eerily still, the only sounds being the incessant tapping and the faint humming. I shone my light toward Mr. Avery's campsite, expecting to see him sitting in his usual spot. But his chair was empty, and his tent stood ominously still. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed something strange. His tent wasn't closed. The flap was slightly open, swaying gently in the breeze. I swallowed hard and crept closer, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I approached the tent, I noticed more symbols, this time carved into the dirt around his campsite in a large circle. The symbols pulsed faintly, as if they were alive with some hidden energy. My stomach churned as I realized these weren't just random markings. This was deliberate, intentional. But why? I hesitated at the entrance to his tent, unsure if I should go inside. The humming was louder now, almost rhythmic, like a chant. My instincts screamed for me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had come too far to stop now. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the flap open and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the overwhelming smell, musty and stale, like the air had been trapped inside for too long. My flashlight revealed a cluttered space filled with odd trinkets, worn books, and pieces of cloth covered in strange writing. In the center of the tent, there was a small wooden box, partially open. The humming seemed to be coming from it, though I couldn't understand how. As I reached toward the box, something cold brushed against my arm. I jerked back, swinging the flashlight wildly. For a split second, I saw something move, a shadowy figure, just at the edge of my vision. My pulse quickened as I scanned the tent, but nothing was there. I was alone, or so I thought. Suddenly, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive. I stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Then a soft voice broke the stillness. "You shouldn't have come in here." I spun around, my flashlight catching Mr. Avery standing in the entrance of the tent, his face hidden in shadow. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and his expression was unreadable. "I warned you," he said quietly, stepping closer. "You have no idea what you've done." I backed away, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice trembling. But Mr. Avery didn't answer. Instead, he reached down and closed the wooden box. As soon as the lid clicked shut, the air seemed to shift. The symbols on the ground faded, and the humming ceased entirely. Without another word, Mr. Avery turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in the suffocating silence. I felt a deep unease settle over me. Something had changed, and I didn't know what. All I knew was that whatever was happening here, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. That night, I couldn't sleep. Mr. Avery's words echoed in my mind. You have no idea what you've done. The weight of them pressed down on me, making it impossible to rest. The campground had taken on an even darker atmosphere, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. The silence around me felt unnatural, as though the forest itself had paused to hold its breath. Hours passed, and still, sleep wouldn't come. I sat up in my tent, listening for any sign of movement, any hint that the strange occurrences would start again. But there was nothing. No tapping, no humming, no whispers in the night. Just silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to wrap itself around me like a shroud. I felt more isolated than ever before. Then, just as I was starting to relax, a faint rustling came from outside the tent. My heart skipped a beat as I strained to listen. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching from the direction of Mr. Avery's campsite. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly in my trembling hand. The air inside the tent felt stifling, thick with dread. As the footsteps drew nearer, I forced myself to unzip the tent flap and peer outside. The night was darker than before, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I shone my flashlight toward Mr. Avery's campsite, but it was empty. His chair was overturned, his tent flapping slightly in the breeze. He was nowhere to be seen. My stomach twisted in knots. Where had he gone? I stepped out of the tent, my breath fogging in the cool night air. The forest was eerily quiet, with not even the usual sounds of nocturnal animals breaking the stillness. I moved cautiously toward Mr. Avery's campsite, my flashlight sweeping over the ground. The symbols that had been carved into the dirt were gone, as though they had never been there at all. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down my spine. I spun around, my flashlight casting a harsh beam through the trees, but nothing was there. The air felt colder now, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. I backed away from the campsite, my instinct screaming at me to leave, to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But before I could take another step, I heard the unmistakable sound of a voice, soft, whispering, almost too quiet to hear. "You can't leave," it said. "Not now." My blood ran cold. I swung the flashlight around wildly, searching for the source of the voice, but all I saw were shadows. Shadows that seemed to shift and move, growing darker and more menacing with every passing second. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, making me stumble. As I scrambled to regain my footing, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall and shadowy, with glowing eyes that watched me intently. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized it wasn't Mr. Avery. This was something else, something much older, much darker. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming. I could feel its gaze boring into me, its intent clear. I wasn't supposed to be here. I had crossed a line I didn't even know existed, and now I was trapped. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I turned and bolted for my tent. I didn't stop until I was inside. The zipper pulled tight behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sat there in the darkness, my heart racing. The silence outside was oppressive, and I knew that whatever I had seen, whatever had been watching me, was still out there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep. When morning finally came, I packed up my campsite and left without looking back. I didn't care what Mr. Avery was guarding, or what secrets the forest held. I just knew I had to get out before it was too late. October 22nd. The crisp autumn air had begun to creep into the forest, bringing with it the earthy smell of fallen leaves and the promise of cold nights. I had chosen this campground for its isolation. Deep in the woods, far from the bustling cities, it was the perfect place to escape. Or at least, that's what I thought. The first sign that something was off came when I saw her, Sarah. She had set up camp not far from mine, though I hadn't noticed her when I first arrived. It was only after nightfall, when I spotted the small, flickering light of her campfire, that I realized I wasn't alone. At first, I was relieved. There was a certain comfort in knowing someone else was nearby. But that comfort quickly faded when I saw her face, pale, drawn, and filled with a kind of dread that made my skin crawl. I hadn't planned on approaching her, but something about the way she sat there, staring blankly into the fire, compelled me to check on her. I approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hey," I called softly. "Are you okay?" She didn't look up at first, just kept staring into the flames as though they held some terrible secret. Then slowly, she turned her head to face me. Her eyes were hollow, dark shadows lining them as if she hadn't slept in days. "I'm hiding," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. I furrowed my brow, unsure of what to make of her words. "Hiding? From what?" I asked, my curiosity piqued, despite the unease gnawing at me. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, as though expecting someone, or something, to emerge from the trees at any moment. "He knows I'm here," she murmured. "He always knows." A chill ran down my spine. There was something deeply unsettling about the way she spoke, like she was living in a constant state of fear. I wanted to ask more, to understand who this he was, but Sarah suddenly stood up, her eyes darting nervously toward the darkened woods. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. You need to leave before it's too late." I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, but before I could get a word out, she turned and hurried off into the trees, leaving her campfire burning and her belongings scattered around the site. I watched her disappear into the darkness, a sinking feeling settling in my gut. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in the air, a heaviness that made my chest tighten. I returned to my own campsite, unable to shake the image of Sarah's haunted expression. I sat by my own campfire, trying to push the strange encounter from my mind, but her words echoed in my head. "He knows I'm here. He always knows." Who was she talking about? And why was she so terrified? The questions swirled in my mind, refusing to let me rest. That night, as I lay in my tent, the forest felt different, darker, more sinister. Every rustle of the leaves, every crack of a branch, set my nerves on edge. I found myself constantly listening for footsteps, for any sign of movement outside. But nothing came, only the quiet hum of the forest, which somehow felt more threatening than ever. And yet, in the distance, I swore I could hear the faint crackling of Sarah's campfire, still burning, though she was nowhere to be seen. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. The memory of Sarah's fearful expression lingered in my mind, as vivid as if it had just happened. I stepped out of my tent and glanced over toward her campsite. Her tent was still there, the campfire long since extinguished, but she was nowhere to be seen. Her belongings remained scattered around the site, untouched. It was as though she had vanished into the night without a trace. I hesitated for a moment before walking over to her campsite. The air was eerily still, not even a breeze stirring the leaves. As I approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I pressed on, determined to find some clue as to what had happened to her. Her tent was slightly open, flapping gently in the still air. I peered inside, half expecting to see her curled up in a corner, but the tent was empty. Her sleeping bag lay unrolled, and a small flashlight was discarded beside it. It looked like she had left in a hurry, leaving everything behind. I crouched down to examine the ground, noticing something strange. A trail of footprints leading away from the campsite and deeper into the woods. The prints were small, likely hers, but there was something odd about them. They seemed erratic, as though she'd been running. Without thinking, I followed the trail, my pulse quickening with every step. The footprints led me further into the forest, winding through dense trees and uneven terrain. The deeper I went, the darker the woods seemed to become. The sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy above, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to shift and writhe with every step I took. As I followed the trail, I began to notice other signs: broken branches, trampled undergrowth, and the occasional scrap of fabric snagged on a bush. It was clear that Sarah had been moving quickly, as though fleeing from something. My heart raced as I pressed on, the sense of unease growing stronger with every passing minute. After what felt like hours, I came upon a small clearing. In the center stood an old, weathered cabin, its wood rotting and its windows cracked. The footprints led straight to the door, which hung slightly ajar. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, a deep sense of foreboding washing over me. Something about the cabin felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this place, like it was a remnant of something long forgotten. Summoning my courage, I approached the cabin. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty clearing. Inside, the air was musty and thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. The interior was dark, with only faint beams of light filtering in through the cracked windows. I stepped inside cautiously, every sense on high alert. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something on the floor, a small, crumpled piece of paper. I bent down to pick it up, recognizing the handwriting immediately. It was one of Sarah's notes. The message was short, scrawled hastily in dark ink. "He's coming for me. I don't know how much longer I can hide." My heart pounded in my chest as I clutched the note tightly. The air in the cabin felt colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in around me. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see Sarah huddled in a corner, but the cabin was empty. She was gone. And whoever or whatever she was running from, I had a sinking feeling it wasn't far behind. I stood frozen in the cabin. Sarah's note clenched tightly in my hand. The walls felt like they were pressing in on me, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. Every instinct told me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't shake the image of Sarah, alone, terrified, somewhere out there in the woods. I had to find her, even if it meant facing whatever she was so desperately hiding from. I stepped back outside, the clearing around the cabin eerily quiet. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. I could still see the faint outline of Sarah's footprints in the dirt, leading away from the cabin and deeper into the forest. I followed them, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts, as the tension in the air thickened with every step. The woods seemed to grow darker the further I went, the canopy overhead blocking out what little light remained. The sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant birds, had faded into an unsettling silence. All I could hear was the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the ground and the rapid pounding of my heart in my chest. As I pushed deeper into the forest, I began to notice something strange. The trees around me were marked with strange symbols, similar to the ones I had seen at Sarah's campsite. They were carved into the bark in haphazard patterns, each one more intricate and disturbing than the last. I couldn't make sense of them, but they filled me with an overwhelming sense of unease. It felt like I was walking through a place that had been touched by something ancient and sinister. I pressed on, my nerves on edge, until I reached a small, secluded glade. In the center of the glade was a stone altar, weathered and cracked with age. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks, my blood running cold. The symbols carved into the stone were the same as the ones on the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this place was somehow connected to whatever had been haunting Sarah. Suddenly, I heard a soft rustling behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. The glade was empty, save for the towering trees and the oppressive silence that hung in the air. I stood there, tense and alert, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the forest remained still. Just as I was about to turn back, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the glade, partially hidden in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was Sarah. She stood there, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. She looked different, almost ghostly, as if she had been through something I couldn't comprehend. "Sarah," I called out, rushing toward her. But as I approached, she took a step back, her expression one of utter terror. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's too late. He's already found me."